The snow was falling in hard, wind-driven veils, sharp as knives against her cheeks, a world of white swallowing every trace of the earth beneath. Evelina May staggered through it, her boots sinking deep into drifts that clutched at her ankles like cold hands. In her arms she cradled 3 bundles, each wrapped in a patchwork of worn cloth and thin quilts, their cries smothered by the storm. The triplets, her daughters, her last tether to life, were newborn, fragile as moth wings, their breath faint puffs against her breast. She pressed them tighter to her body, trying to give what little warmth remained in her. The wind stole most of it away. Behind her, the dark silhouette of Silas, her father-in-law, had already turned his horse. She had seen him twist in the saddle, his face a pale mask of contempt against the stormlight, before he urged the animal forward and left her. No backward glance, no word. He had pronounced his judgment before leaving. "You'll not bring ruin on my name, girl. Better the snow take you than I keep feeding mouths born to weakness." His words carried the chill of the wind itself, sharp and absolute. Then he had gone, his figure swallowed by distance, leaving her alone with the babies and the blizzard. The sky was bruised gray, swirling with snowflakes thick enough to blur the line of the horizon. Evelina's breath came ragged, her ribs aching with every gasp of frozen air. Her body was weak still from childbirth, only days passed, and the ache in her bones deepened with each step. She stumbled, fell to her knees, nearly crushing the bundle closest to her chest, then forced herself upright again. She whispered small, cracked reassurances into the storm, not knowing whether her daughters could even hear over the howl. Her hair, damp from sweat and snow, clung to her temples. The shawl she wore was stiff with frost, edges curling with ice. Her hands shook so violently that she feared she would drop one of the babies. She shifted her hold, pressing 2 close beneath her arms, the third in the crook of her elbow. Their small fists twitched in the cold. Their lips were pale. The prairie stretched endless around her, but in the storm it seemed no more than a swirling cage. Pines in the distance bent beneath the wind, their tops lashing like whips. The cabin she had once called home, Silas's cabin, not truly hers, was already invisible, erased by the blizzard's breath. Every direction looked the same. White. Wind. Silence broken only by her own heartbeat, and the thin cries muffled against her chest. Her mind circled back to her husband, gone too soon. Thomas had been gentle in ways his father never was, his voice carrying a quiet steadiness that had steadied her own fears when she was a bride. Fever had taken him one winter night, the sweat soaking through quilts even as she begged heaven to spare him. When he was buried on the ridge, Silas's eyes had been flint. He had never once called her by her name afterward, only girl, only burden. And now, with Thomas gone and 3 mouths at her breast, she was cast out into the snow. The wind shifted, carrying with it a sound she thought might be water, or distant bells. But it was only her own pulse roaring in her ears. She tried to walk faster, tried to think of where she might go. The town was miles away, too far for a woman so newly torn by birth, and her strength waned by the hour. She thought of knocking at some lonely door, of begging strangers for a place by the fire, but shame pressed heavier than the snow. Silas's voice haunted her, reminding her of her place, an unwanted widow with too many children, too weak to survive without a man's hand guiding her. She whispered instead to the triplets, clinging to their fragile breaths. "Hush now, doves, hush. Mama will find a way." Her lips cracked as she spoke, and the words blew away as quickly as she breathed them. Her knees gave again, plunging her thigh deep into a drift. She stayed there a moment, shuddering, unable to rise. Her tears froze on her cheeks. She remembered, faint and sweet, the way Thomas once lifted her into his arms and carried her over a flooded creek, his laugh warm in her ear. That memory now cut like a blade. She tried to picture his face, but the storm was erasing even that. The babies stirred faintly, their cries no longer strong but broken gasps. Panic rose in her like a fire. She forced herself up, staggering forward with no direction, only motion. She could not let them die here in the snow. She would walk until her legs broke if it meant even one of them lived. The hours blurred. Light shifted behind the storm, a dim blue pressing against darker clouds, but she could not tell whether dawn was failing or dusk was drawing near. She stumbled upon a half-buried fence post, clutched it to steady herself, then pressed on. Her vision swam with specks of white, her ears filled with the storm's roar. Her body sagged lower with each step. At last, the weight was too much. Her arms trembled, numb and stiff. She sank again to her knees, this time not rising. She pulled her daughters into her lap, wrapping herself around them, trying to be a shield. Snow piled against her back, covering her shawl, burying her slowly as though the earth itself were drawing her down. She closed her eyes, whispering prayer without words, a rhythm of breath and sorrow. In that half-sleep of cold, she thought she heard Thomas calling, his voice somewhere just out of reach. She turned her head toward it, lips forming his name. Her eyelids were too heavy to lift. Then, faint but clear, came another sound. A low rumble through the earth, like hooves pounding frozen ground. Evelina forced her eyes open, though frost sealed her lashes. She thought she saw shadows moving through the white, vast shapes against the storm. Fear pricked her. Bandits? Wolves? She curled tighter over the infants, her body a frail wall. The rumble grew closer, heavier, steady. Not wolves. Not the frantic pounding of fleeing deer. This was deliberate. Hooves. A rider. Her heart hammered. She tried to stand, but her legs refused. She could not flee even if she wanted. The wind parted for a moment, a sudden break in the swirl, and through it she saw the outline of a horse cresting the rise. Upon its back loomed a figure unlike any she had imagined. Tall, broad, shirtless despite the storm, hair tied back against the wind. His skin gleamed bronze against the snow, his chest ridged with muscle, a great scar running across his shoulder. The sight of him was almost dreamlike, a vision torn from fever or from firelight. She blinked, certain she must be delirious. The figure drew nearer, the horse's breath streaming white. The man dismounted in one smooth motion, boots crunching in the drift. He stood a head taller than any she had known, the storm bending around him as if unwilling to touch him. His dark eyes fixed on her, not cruel, not curious, but steady as stone. Evelina clutched the babies tighter, terror and awe mingling in her chest. She could not speak. The man stepped closer, slowly, lowering himself to one knee beside her. Snow clung to his skin, but he seemed untouched by the cold. His gaze moved to the infants, their tiny faces pale and still. Something softened in his expression. Without a word, he unfastened the heavy deerskin cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it around all three children, tucking the folds close with surprising gentleness. His hands were scarred, strong, yet careful as though holding glass. Evelina shivered, torn between fear and the sudden rush of heat from the cloak. The storm howled on, but in that moment there was a silence between them, a hollow in the blizzard where only breath and heartbeat lived. Evelina searched his face for intent, for danger, for anything that might tell her what this apparition wanted. He met her gaze only once, and in his eyes she saw no hunger, no threat, only recognition, as though he had been searching the snow for her all along. Her lips parted, a question trembling there, but no words came. The storm roared louder, and the man reached down, sliding one arm beneath her, the other gathering the children, lifting them with ease. Evelina gasped at the sudden strength that carried them all, her world tipping. The blizzard swallowed the sound of his boots as he began to walk, carrying her against his chest, her daughters safe within his cloak. Evelina clung weakly, her fear not gone but shifting into something else, an unfamiliar ache of safety. Behind them, the prairie howled, erasing her tracks, erasing the last mark of Silas's betrayal. And in the storm's hollow heart, Evelina closed her eyes against the wind, feeling not the cold but the thrum of a stranger's heartbeat steady beneath her cheek. She did not yet know his name. She only knew that death had turned aside, and something larger than the blizzard had found her. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine sap, its logs blackened by years of firelight. Evelina's eyes fluttered open to that glow, her body trembling from the memory of cold though warmth now cradled her. She lay on a bed of furs, the babies beside her, swaddled in a cloak far too heavy to be her own. The storm outside still raged, the wind keening against the chinks in the walls, but inside it was as though she had stumbled into another world. A world carved from quiet and the steady pulse of survival. The man was there, the giant who had lifted her from the snow as if she weighed nothing. He crouched near the hearth, feeding cedar branches into the flames. Firelight drew copper across his skin, picking out the lines of old scars, on his back, across his shoulder, etched into the muscle of his arms. His hair, black and tied with leather at the nape, hung loose in the heat, glinting with moisture from melted snow. His chest rose and fell evenly, a man utterly unbothered by the cold that had nearly stolen her life. He had not spoken. Not once since he carried her through the blizzard. Not when he laid her down on the furs, nor when he tended to the babies, placing them near the fire's warmth and wrapping them again in skins. His silence was not cruel. It was something deeper, something that steadied the room rather than hollowed it. Evelina watched him with both fear and bewilderment, uncertain if she had been saved or claimed. Her throat burned with dryness. She tried to sit, but weakness pressed her back down. The smallest whimper from one of the triplets filled the space, and her heart lurched. She struggled again, managing to push herself upright, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. The man turned his head then. His eyes, dark and still, found hers. She froze, her breath catching, every story she had ever heard about men like him rising sharp in her memory. Whispers of raids, of cruelty, of women taken and never seen again. Yet his gaze was not sharp. It was steady, quiet, as though he was simply measuring whether she could rise on her own. He reached for a carved wooden bowl near the fire, lifted it, and crossed the cabin. The ground seemed to shift beneath his weight, his frame filling the small room. He set the bowl on the ground beside her. Steam rose faintly from it, the smell of broth, thin but warm. He gestured once, simple, for her to drink. Her lips parted but no words came. She wanted to ask his name, to ask where she was, to ask if he meant to keep her here. Instead she reached with shaking fingers for the bowl, lifting it to her lips. The heat scalded her mouth at first, but soon it spread through her chest, loosening the ice that clung to her bones. She drank until it was gone. The man returned to the fire without comment. His silence unsettled her, but at the same time it steadied her heart. He moved with certainty, every action considered, adding wood, adjusting skins, checking on the babies without intrusion. When one stirred he leaned close, his large hand hovering as though to reassure, but never daring to touch without care. Evelina watched his hands most of all. They were enormous, calloused, scarred, hands that could break stone, and yet they paused each time they neared her daughters, as if waiting for some invisible permission. She swallowed, her voice rough from cold and disuse. "Why?" It slipped from her like a breath, but the word filled the room. His head tilted slightly, the fire's light catching his cheekbone. He did not answer. Perhaps he did not understand. Perhaps he chose not to. She pressed her palm over one baby's small body, reassured by the faint rise and fall of breath beneath the deerskin. She should be terrified, she told herself. She should guard every moment, plan escape, for here she was, alone with a stranger in the wilderness, a man whose people and hers were not bound by kindness but blood and mistrust. Yet the longer she sat, the less the fear burned. Something else replaced it, a reluctant calm, as though the storm outside had been drawn into this man's chest and stilled there. Time passed slowly, measured by the cracking of the fire. Evelina dozed, woke, checked the babies, then drifted again. Each time she lifted her eyes he was there, either sitting against the wall with his knife in hand, carving smooth shapes from wood, or moving with quiet economy around the room. He seemed to need no speech, no explanation. His presence filled the silence more fully than words could have. When hunger gnawed again, he set food before her, a strip of venison, roasted, the edges blackened but fragrant. She tore at it with shaking hands, ashamed at her own greed yet unable to stop. He did not watch her eat. His eyes stayed on the fire, as though her survival were not a favor he had given but something natural, inevitable. The triplets whimpered once more. Evelina lifted one, pressing the infant to her breast. Her milk came slow, weakened by the cold and hunger she had endured. Tears stung her eyes as the child sucked feebly. She bent over, whispering promises. When the baby quieted, she laid her down again, heart heavy with worry that her body might not give enough. The man rose then, moving to a shelf where herbs and roots hung in small bundles. He chose one, ground it between stones, and boiled it with water in a pot over the flames. The scent was strange, sharp and earthy. When it was done, he poured a little into a horn cup, cooled it, and offered it to her. She looked at him, uncertain. He gestured faintly, "Drink." She hesitated, then sipped. Bitterness clung to her tongue, but warmth followed. She understood slowly that this was for her strength, for milk. She set the cup aside and whispered, almost to herself, "You, help us." Her voice broke on the words. His gaze met hers again, and in that look was something she could not name, something that cut through fear, recognition, as though he saw her not as burden or enemy, but as another soul carrying weight. The storm outside deepened into night. Shadows stretched across the cabin, firelight licking the walls. Evelina drifted in and out of half-sleep, haunted by images of Silas turning his horse, by the echo of rejection in his voice. Shame pressed heavy on her chest, sharper even than the cold had been. She wondered if the town whispered already. How quickly word would spread that she had been abandoned, how easily her name would rot in their mouths. Yet each time she woke to check, the babies breathed, their tiny chests rising against the deerskin, and each time she saw the silent giant seated by the fire, eyes reflecting flame, guarding not with chains but with presence. When dawn bled gray through the cracks in the logs, Evelina stirred fully. Her body still ached, but strength seeped back. She shifted, the triplets stirring with her, small cries breaking the quiet. She soothed them quickly, then dared at last to speak again. "Your name," she said, voice soft, tentative. For a long moment he did not answer. He rose, stepped outside into the snow. The cold gusted in with him when he returned, carrying water from a half-buried barrel. Only when he set it down did he speak, his voice low, a deep rumble as though drawn from the earth itself. "Now well." The sound of it lingered in the air. He did not say more. But Evelina felt something shift at hearing it, a thread tying her to this stranger, binding the silence into something less empty. She repeated it under her breath, tasting the syllables, then looked down at her daughters. She could not yet trust, not fully. But the memory of Silas turning his back burned sharper than the fear of this man's presence. Nawel had not turned away. He had walked into the storm and carried her out. That truth was a small flame against the darkness, but it was flame nonetheless. The hours passed. Evelina gathered fragments of strength, fed the babies, watched Nawel move about the cabin with unhurried grace. She did not know what he wanted of her, or whether the world outside would claim her again. But when night fell once more and she found herself still breathing, still holding her daughters, she whispered her first prayer of gratitude in weeks. Outside, the wind howled like wolves circling. Inside, the fire snapped, throwing sparks that faded into ash. Nawel sat across from her, carving again, eyes lowered. Evelina, unable to stop herself, watched him through the flicker of flame. He was a stranger still, a danger perhaps, yet she saw in the curve of his brow and the stillness of his mouth not cruelty, but patience. Her heart trembled, both afraid and steadied. She knew her life had turned down a path she could not see the end of. She knew shame and fear would follow her still. But for now in this cabin, she and her daughters were not dying in the snow. And as her eyes began to close again, she thought she saw him look at the infants with a reverence so deep it startled her, as though they were more than children, as though they were the very reason he had stepped into the storm at all. The fire cracked, the wind pressed at the walls, and Evelina's breath slowed into sleep. Her body curled around the warmth of her daughters. The last image she carried into her dreams was Nawel's silent figure, carved against the glow, watching over them with the weight of someone who had chosen not once, but over and over again to stay. Snow had a way of softening the world, muting the harsh lines of ridge and forest, burying even the memory of roads. By the third morning in Nawel's cabin, Evelina felt that time itself had slowed, stretched into something fragile. Each hour measured not by clocks but by firewood stacked and babies fed. Her body still ached from childbirth, but warmth and food had brought a bloom of strength back into her limbs. She moved more easily now, though she never forgot that her survival was tied to the silent man who had pulled her from the blizzard. He rose with dawn, his broad frame casting long shadows across the cabin as he pulled on boots and stepped outside into the cold. The door's creak was followed by the dull thud of wood being split, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Evelina sat near the hearth with her daughters, listening. There was something anchoring in that sound, each stroke reminding her they were not adrift, not lost. She hushed her daughters with whispers, rocking them in her arms, and allowed herself for the first time in weeks to believe they might see spring. When he returned, carrying logs stacked high in his arms, she looked up and caught his gaze. It was brief, a moment no longer than the breath it took for him to cross the room, but it held something more than silence. Not pity, not ownership. A recognition. Two souls forced together by storm and survival. She lowered her eyes quickly, unsure how much of herself might be visible in her face. The days unfolded with a rhythm Evelina began to learn. Nawel tended to the snares he had laid in the woods, brought back rabbits and once a deer, its breath steaming in the snow as he dragged it to the cabin. He carved tools from bone, mended traps with sinew, moved with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged to the land as much as the pines or rivers did. Evelina found herself watching him when she thought he would not notice. His patience as he worked a knife across wood, the way he paused before touching anything fragile, the respect that shaped his every motion. She, in turn, began to do small tasks. She swept the floor with a broom of willow branches, washed the bowls, tried to stitch torn cloth though her hands shook. She fed the triplets, though her milk still came uneven, and wept quietly when one wailed longer than she could soothe. It was Nawel who surprised her then, placing before her a small bundle of herbs steeped in hot water, nodding once. She drank, bitterness sharp on her tongue, and hours later felt the ache in her chest ease, milk flowing stronger. She whispered thanks, her voice small, but he did not answer. His silence was both shield and mystery, something she could not yet cross. At night the storm deepened, the wind tearing at the walls like a beast. Evelina lay close to her daughters, their tiny bodies pressed against her. Sometimes she woke to find Nawel still seated by the fire, eyes reflecting flame as if he had not moved since dusk. Once, half in dream, she thought she saw him bend slightly, gaze lingering not on her but on the infants, his hand lifting as though to trace the curve of their cheeks before stopping, falling back to his knee. She held that image in her heart without daring to speak it aloud. It was on the 5th day that the world outside intruded. Evelina had stepped outside briefly, the triplets swaddled in furs near the fire, while Nawel skinned a rabbit by the door. The storm had cleared, leaving a sky pale as bone, snow glittering sharp beneath the sun. She breathed deep, the cold stinging her lungs, and for the first time she thought of walking beyond the cabin, of finding her way toward town. But the thought withered as soon as it came. She could not drag 3 infants across that frozen land again. Still, she lifted her face to the horizon, and there in the distance, she saw smoke curling upward. Not from Nawel's fire. From the town. Her stomach tightened. Rumors would have already spread of her disappearance, her supposed death. And if whispers carried back that she lived, sheltered by an Apache man, what would they call her then? She tasted the answer in her mouth already. Whore, cursed traitor. Shame pressed harder than the cold. She turned back, and Nawel was watching her. His knife paused over the rabbit, blood bright against snow. His gaze held hers, steady. He said nothing, but she felt as if he had read the whole of her fear in that glance. She lowered her eyes, unable to bear it. That night, the midwife came. Evelina heard the knock, soft but urgent, and her heart nearly leapt from her chest. Nawel opened the door, filling its frame. Beyond him stood the old woman, wrapped in wool, eyes wide when she saw Evelina alive. She entered without asking, her hands quick to check the babies, her mouth muttering prayers. "You should be dead," she whispered, voice trembling. "The whole town said Silas cast you out. We thought the snow had swallowed you." Evelina bowed her head, shame burning her skin. The midwife's gaze flicked to Nawel, lingering with suspicion. "They'll say worse when they hear you're here," she muttered. "Already tongues wag about the Apache who carried you off. Some call it rescue. Others won't." The words cut deep. Evelina felt her chest tighten, as though ropes bound her ribs. She looked at Nawel then, waiting for some flicker of anger, some denial or claim. But he did not move. His silence filled the room heavier than speech. The midwife stayed long enough to see that the babies lived, then left, shaking her head, muttering of God's mysteries. When the door closed, Evelina's tears spilled. She clutched her daughters, whispering apologies to their tiny ears. She expected Noel to turn away from her weakness, but instead he stepped close, placing another log on the fire, its crackle cutting through her sobs. He stood over her then, not touching, not speaking, only steadying the air with his presence until her breathing slowed. She lifted her eyes, and in the fire's glow she saw no judgment, no question. Only patience. It was that night Evelina felt something shift within her. Not love, not yet. But trust, fragile as a flame in the wind. For the first time, she believed she might not be utterly alone in this world. The following days, she found herself testing that trust in small ways. She asked his name again, and when he repeated it, "Noel," she spoke it back, letting the syllables roll in her mouth, watching how his eyes flickered at the sound. She began to hum as she rocked her daughters, old songs her mother had sung, and though she thought her voice too thin to matter, she caught Noel once pausing in his work, head tilted as if listening. One evening, as snow drifted lazily outside and the fire cast long golden lines across the floor, Evelina sat with one daughter in her lap, the other two asleep nearby. She looked up and found Noel watching her, his gaze fixed not on her body, but on the child she held. His expression was unreadable, yet something in it reached her, an ache, a longing, a reverence. Her heart stumbled in her chest. She wanted to ask, to break the silence, to know what wound lived in him. But fear held her tongue. Still, their eyes met, and she did not look away. For a moment it felt as though the storm outside, the judgment of town, the cruelty of Silas, all had fallen away, leaving only the quiet fire, the sleeping infants, and the shared weight of two people who knew what it meant to lose everything. The triplets stirred, one letting out a thin wail. Evelina hushed her quickly, pressing her to her breast. She looked at Noel again, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're all I have." His gaze softened, and though his lips did not move, the truth pressed between them as if spoken. "You are not alone." The days grew into a rhythm almost like peace. Evelina felt her strength deepen, her daughters grow sturdier. She watched Noel move about the cabin with the same steady patience, but now each motion seemed to echo louder within her. His silence was no longer frightening, but a presence she leaned on, something that steadied the trembling inside her. She found herself waiting for his return each time he left for the woods, her breath easing only when his broad figure filled the doorway again. Still, fear lingered at the edges. She knew the town's whispers would not stay whispers. She knew Silas was not finished. He would not let his shame rest quietly in the snow. On the 9th night, as the storm rattled the windows and Evelina rocked her daughters near the fire, she looked up and caught Noel watching her again. But this time his gaze held something she had not seen before, a spark, a recognition, almost like a vow. Her breath caught. She could not name it, but she knew something was changing. The fire cracked, sparks leaping upward. Evelina pressed her daughters closer, her heart unsteady. She knew their quiet days would not last. She knew the world outside would come knocking. And in Noel's steady gaze, she felt both dread and hope twined together. Something was coming, and when it did, their fragile trust would be tested in fire. The first sign of their coming was not a sound but a shift in the air, a tightening of silence that pressed even through the thick cabin walls. Evelina sat near the fire with her daughters, her shawl wrapped close, when she felt it, the old prickle of fear along her skin, the memory of being cast into the storm. The triplets stirred uneasily, their small cries like a warning. She looked to Noel, who stood by the door, his knife paused above the strip of wood he had been carving. His head lifted. His eyes, dark and steady, flicked once toward her, then to the window where pale light broke through the frost. He said nothing, but his stillness told her what she already knew. Someone was coming. Hooves broke the quiet soon after, muffled at first by snow, then clearer, the rhythm of several riders drawing close. Evelina's breath caught. She thought of Silas, his hard mouth, his horse wheeling away from her into the blizzard. She thought of the town's whispers, of the midwife's warning, of shame that spread faster than fire. Her arms tightened around the babies, though they were already swaddled deep. The air inside the cabin grew close, the fire snapping sharply as if to protest what approached. Nawel set the knife aside, rose to his full height, and crossed the room in long measured strides. He did not speak to reassure her, nor did he look back for approval. He opened the door and stepped out into the snow. Cold winds swept in with him, biting her cheeks, carrying the muffled voices of men beyond the ridge. She pushed herself to her feet, clutching the nearest child, and moved to the window. Through the frost-laced glass she saw them, 4 riders against the pale morning, one at their lead. Silas! He was wrapped in a heavy coat, the horse beneath him stamping impatiently, steam curling from its nostrils. His face was carved from stone, lined not by age alone, but by bitterness that had sharpened every feature. Behind him rode 3 men from the town, men Evelina had once nodded to in passing, men who had avoided her eyes at church when Thomas fell ill. Their mouths were set hard now, their gazes flinty. They had come not to mourn but to claim. Nawel stood bare-chested in the snow, only his trousers and boots shielding him from the cold. His skin was burnished bronze against the white, his breath steady, his presence unshaken. The horsemen drew rein a few yards from him. For a moment the world was nothing but that line, the riders with their anger and the silent man who met them with nothing but his stillness. "You've taken what isn't yours," Silas called, his voice carrying like a whip. "The girl and her brats belong to me. You think you can keep them? You'll hand them back, or you'll answer for it." Inside the cabin, Evelina's knees trembled. The weight of those words dragged her back to the night he left her in the storm. She felt the cold all over again, the taste of despair. But now there was fire between her and the door, and in that fire's glow her daughters breathed softly. She straightened, pulse quickening, and pressed her palm against the window frame, as if to steady herself against the tide of fear. Nawel did not answer. He stood as if carved from the mountain itself, his gaze locked on the man who had abandoned Evelina. The silence stretched, more powerful than any words. Silas's horse shifted, unsettled by it, stamping at the snow. The townsmen glanced at one another, waiting for movement, but none came. At last Silas barked, "Do you hear me, savage? Give her back. She's nothing without her husband, nothing but shame. I'll not have her ruin my name further. Those children will starve with her if you don't hand them over." The words struck Evelina like blows. Shame rose hot in her chest, threatening to drown her. But then another feeling flared beneath it, fiercer, sharper. The memory of Nawel's steady hand offering her broth, the way he had wrapped her daughters in his cloak without question, the patience in his eyes when the town's judgment weighed heavy. She could no longer stand silent. She opened the cabin door, the cold rushing in to bite her skin, and stepped out, the babies swaddled in her arms. Her hair whipped across her face, her thin shawl no match for the wind, but she did not retreat. She stood at Nawel's side, her voice trembling but carrying through the snow. "I am not yours to return," she said, her words breaking the stillness. "You left me to die, Silas. You turned your back when I begged for mercy. These children live not by your hand, but by his." She nodded toward Nawel, her arms tightening around the infants. "If you call me shame, then I will bear it. But I will not walk back into your house, nor raise my daughters beneath your scorn. You cast me out. You do not get to claim me now." The men shifted uneasily, their horses stamping, breath curling white. Silas's face darkened, fury sharpening his mouth. He raised a hand as though to strike the air, but the gesture faltered when Nawel moved. The Apache took one step forward, slow and deliberate. Snow crunched beneath his boots. His shoulders squared, his gaze unwavering, and the air seemed to tighten around him. He did not raise his hand, did not bear a weapon. He only stood, his body a wall between Evelina and the men who would take her. The silence deepened until even the wind seemed to hush. Silas's horse snorted, tossing its head. One of the townsmen muttered a curse, tugging at his reins. Fear crept in where anger had been. Nawel's presence was too vast, too immovable. It was as though the storm itself stood with him. Silas spat into the snow, his fury leaking into the frozen ground. "So be it," he growled. "She'll learn soon enough what it means to cling to a ghost. Let the whole town see her for what she is." He yanked the reins, wheeling his horse. The others followed, though none dared meet Nawel's eyes as they rode back into the pale horizon. Their hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the vast silence of winter. Evelina's body trembled, though her voice had not faltered. When the men disappeared, she sagged slightly, her knees threatening to give. Nawel turned then, his gaze falling to her arms, to the daughters swaddled close. He did not speak, but his eyes held a question. Was she steady? Could she stand? She drew in a breath, lifting her chin despite the tears that burned hot on her cheeks. They stepped back inside together, closing the door against the wind. The fire crackled loud in the sudden quiet. Evelina sank to her knees near the hearth, laying the babies gently down on furs. Her body shook from more than cold. It shook from release, from the weight of words spoken that could never be unsaid. She had defied Silas. She had chosen her place. Nawel crouched beside the fire, his gaze still on her. His silence was no longer unreadable. She could see in the set of his jaw, in the softening of his eyes, that he had heard every word. She met his gaze, breath-catching, and felt something deepen between them, a bond no storm could erase. For the first time since Thomas's death, Evelina's chest filled not with dread, but with a fragile, unsteady hope. It trembled like flame, but held against the draught. She pressed her hand over one infant's chest, feeling the small heartbeat flutter. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the quiet. "We're safe now." Nawel did not answer, but his hand shifted slightly, resting on the floor beside hers, close enough that the warmth of his skin brushed her knuckles. She did not pull away. She let the silence speak. Outside, the storm moved on, the sky clearing to a pale blue streaked with sun. Inside, firelight painted their faces, the children asleep in its glow. Evelina lifted her eyes once more to Nawel, and in his gaze she saw not just the man who had carried her from death, but the man who had stood when others would have turned away. And as the fire crackled, she knew with sudden clarity that though shame and judgment might follow her forever, here in this cabin with this silent giant she had found something stronger, something that felt like home. The door rattled faintly in the wind, the world outside still waiting. Evelina's hand tightened over Nawel's, and she whispered to herself a vow she had never dared before. She would not run. She would not return. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And in the quiet that followed, as if the land itself was holding its breath, Nawel finally spoke. Not many words, only enough to tremble through her chest like a vow carved into stone. "You are safe." The fire flared, sparks rising, as though the earth had heard him and agreed.